Eric was born and raised in the United States. He was always an open-hearted person and very determined with the things he set out to do. As a teenager, he was a very curious and active boy. Although he lived in a big city like Portland, he was always hiking in the region's parks and woods. He had immense bravery to go deep into the forest until he found rivers and waterfalls. But Eric was terrified of encountering a bear on his way. When he finished high school, his parents asked him what career he intended to pursue. Eric had no doubts. He said he would be a police officer. Eric was more interested in protecting the community and how he could make a difference without hurting anyone. But he was aware that if he were a police officer, he would also have to participate in direct action against people with bad intentions. Still, Eric did not abandon his purpose. He was always up to date on current legislation and approached people in a professional manner. The young police officer did all the rigorous training at the academy as instructed in the booklet. What he didn't know was that life was about to put his vocation in helping people to the test, and in a very severe way. Years passed, and Eric Wilson remained on the streets of Portland. He carried out routine patrols, participated in investigations linked to the sale of narcotics, and occasionally chased criminals through the neighborhoods. But the day that changed everything for the police officer started like any other. He left the building, got into the car, and started his patrol. He drove through a few neighborhoods, taking careful notice of everything he could. Suddenly, as he slowly entered a residential area on the edge of the city, the officer heard a very unusual noise, which caught his attention. At that time, there weren't many people on the street. Most had already left for work. In a state of alert, he decided to turn off the car with the intention of hearing the sound again. Eric decided to get out of the car to look for the source of that noise more calmly and precisely. He wasn't sure what was going on, but it seemed like something worth investigating. He followed the noise to a well-known and dangerous corner due to drug trafficking and crimes caused by disputes between rival gangs. And it was precisely this heavy history of the region that worried the officer. As he walked through the neighborhood, he kept his hand near his holster, praying he wouldn't have to draw his gun. Eric was tense. I thought anything could happen at any moment. As soon as she turned the corner, the sound started to get louder. She stopped and tried to identify where exactly that noise was coming from, and when she realized it was from a dumpster next to it. At first, he thought it was a cat, but as he got closer, he was sure that the situation was much more serious than he imagined. What he saw was unbelievable. His legs were shaky and his heart was racing. The sound was that of a baby. It was abandoned there in a dumpster, next to several bags of trash and blowflies. Eric was shocked. It was the first time he had come across a child in that state. The child was extremely weak, but still had the strength to cry, which was a very important sign. Eric still had a chance to save the boy. The police officer couldn't believe what he saw. He thought about how someone had been so cruel, to the point of abandoning a defenseless being like that, in such a degrading situation. So the police officer, without much thinking, acted quickly. While the baby was crying, the police officer removed the rubbish that was on top of his body and very carefully pulled him out of the bin, placing the child in his arms. Despite still showing clear vital signs, Eric realized that something was strange, as the boy seemed to be breathing with some difficulty. With no time to waste, he immediately called the ambulance. After all, the little boy had been in the trash for who knows how long. He didn't let go of the baby for a minute, keeping him wrapped up and firmly in his arms. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, and even though there were nurses and paramedics on the rescue team, Eric felt he should accompany him. He looked at the baby in his arms, who seemed a little calmer, feeling safe with him. So he did what his heart told him. He got into the ambulance with the rescue team and went with them to the hospital without taking his attention off the child at any time. On the way, Eric realized that he could no longer handle the baby without giving him a name. So, he started calling the little one Brian, in honor of his bravery. At the hospital, the doctor did several tests to make sure the child was okay. However, Eric feared that Brian had contracted an illness as a result of being left in direct contact with the trash. Fortunately, despite everything, no signs of illness or serious symptoms were found. The doctor only drew attention to redness on the boy's foot, which could be an allergic reaction due to contact with waste. It was very difficult for Eric to have to leave Brian alone in the hospital while he returned to his home and family. But while the boy was under medical supervision, Eric made a point of visiting him every day. Little by little, Brian gained strength and regained his health. Social workers took care of the case, and before long, he was chosen for adoption by a young couple, Diana and Harley Cooper. They lived in the city of Eugene, south of Portland, and fell in love with the boy as soon as they met him. And of course, they were also touched by the story of his abandonment. During the adoption process, the couple learned that Eric Wilson had been the police officer responsible for finding him and also for naming him Brian. Diana and Harley Cooper liked the name and decided to keep it, which made Eric very happy. At the same time as I was relieved that the little one found a home so quickly, I was sad about not being able to see him every day. At the hospital, visiting him made Eric feel connected to Brian and also a little responsible for him. Brian grew up in a home full of love and care. The Cooper couple never hid from the boy that he had been adopted. He didn't become an angry person because of his biological mother's rejection, but he always found himself thinking about what could have happened, so that he ended up abandoned in a dumpster. This was a thought that bothered him, and no matter how much he imagined different situations, it would never be enough to satisfy his dismay. Diana and Harley knew that that question might never be answered, but they wanted to comfort their son's heart and mind in some way. To do so, one day they contacted the Portland police and asked for Eric. Then they learned that the police officer was no longer with that force, but had become a veteran of Oregon State Parks. Eric had requested a transfer sometime after the incident with Brian. In a way, meeting that baby had awakened in him the desire to work in a type of policing that was more in line with his lifestyle. The couple remembered Eric's concern and how he had gone beyond the call of duty to ensure Brian's protection and recovery. At their insistence, they managed to contact Captain Phillips, who was now retired, but knew the whereabouts of the former police officer. I think Eric was more of a social worker than a police officer, but now, at least, he is among the animals in the forest. He must be happier helping tourists and adventurers, away from fighting crimes. That's what he told the couple, before giving the contact details of Eric's new division. Over the phone, they learned that Eric never forgot what happened that day, and that he often found himself thinking about what would have happened to the boy after his adoption. So they arranged a meeting at Eric's cabin, near a national park. It would be a great reunion. Brian was very happy. He could finally meet the person who saved him amidst the trash. He wanted to take the opportunity to thank you for caring so much about him at that moment. The days passed quickly, and finally the meeting took place. Eric was very excited to see Brian all grown up and healthy, so different from when he rescued him. He explained to the teenager that he never had children, and the closest he came to feeling like a father was when he held Brian in his arms for the first time. I know it sounds silly, but at that moment, something changed. I felt a little of what a father who has his son in danger must feel. Brian, then moved, gave Eric a hug and said he needed to thank him in person. The boy took advantage of the moment and said he wanted to meet his biological mother so he could forgive her in person. He also wanted to know if Eric Wilson knew anything about his past that would help him locate his mother. At that moment, Eric's smile disappeared. Anyway, he said he had tried to investigate who his mother could be. He wanted to search Portland's maternity wards for the names of all the women who had given birth in the 2 or 3 months before Brian was abandoned. But his efforts were blocked by Captain Felix. The captain said that if he wanted to fix the world, he should go after real bad guys. Because of sarcasm like that, I left the corporation. Now it's been so long that I don't even know if it's possible to track it. I'm sorry, added Eric. The boy was devastated by that information. So, he would not be able to find his mother and understand what had happened 16 years ago. At the end of the meeting, before the boy and his parents left, the young man and the former police officer exchanged contact details and decided to meet whenever possible. Brian just didn't expect the unbelievable news he would receive from Eric shortly afterwards. It turns out that Eric realized how important it was for Brian to meet his mother and took a week off from his role to pick up the investigation where he left off 16 years ago. He knew it would be difficult, but he wouldn't start from scratch, as he had saved a lot of information in an old file. Eric started by calling every maternity hospital in Portland and asking for birth files from that time. Not all hospitals had properly organized files from that period, so he had to make do with what they sent him, and he had to rely a lot on luck. Fortunately, the files they sent had very complete information on each patient, and they were able to discard files that deviated from the standard. Eric spent 2 full days sorting through chips and another day making phone calls. It was already 9 p.m. on a Thursday when he learned of a woman named Diana Howie who had given birth to a boy, almost 2 months before Eric found the baby in the trash. Among all the chips that survived the test of time, that seemed to be the best bet. That same night, she called the Cooper family. He said the woman lived somewhere on the outskirts of the woods, and they would have to go there to talk to her, as there was no phone record in her name. Diana and Harley were amazed by the information, as the forest was just a few kilometers from where they lived. If confirmed, it was possible that Brian had practically grown up alongside his biological mother without knowing her, and without having the slightest notion that she was closer than he could imagine. The next day, Eric went to the dini with his truck and picked up young Brian. From there, they drove along dirt roads and cross streams until they found a small village of cabins occupied by workers in the region's timber industry. With a few questions to the people who lived there, they identified Diana Harley's house. When they knocked on the door, a woman under 40 answered them, with a cigarette in her hands. She looked suspicious and took a good look at Brian. Eric Wilson introduced himself as a park ranger and former Portland police officer, and wanted to know if the woman had lived in the city about 16 years ago. The woman said yes, but that she hoped one day to be able to forget the city and everything she lived in it. Eric asked if she could say what had happened, and the woman confessed that she had been a horrible person, and that if today she was nothing more than a poor widow, it was because she had deserved that fate. I cursed myself, I'm sure of it. God didn't wait for me to die to punish me. I married a bad man. I did bad things, and now I live at the end of the world alone with my guilt, said Diana. By chance, did one of those things you did in the past involve a baby? Eric asked, trying to sound as friendly as possible. Diana opened her eyes full of tears. He began to cry and say that his time had finally come. Did you come to arrest me? I told him that we were going to pay for what he did, I said, Diana said. In an increasingly anguished tone, Eric said she needed to calm down and asked what the story was. Diana explained that she had gotten married at the age of 18 to Jeremias Roy, a boy who had transformed into a totally different person since he started working for an industry, cutting wood in the forests. When Jeremiah discovered that Diana was pregnant, he not only expressed unhappiness, but also suspected that the child was not his. The entire gestation period had been a real hell, and Diana suffered several threats daily. Jeremiah said he would leave, or that he wouldn't let her leave the house. He asked her not to have the baby. Diana was afraid of the threats, but she thought that when the child was born, Jeremiah would see how the boy would be like him, and then his attitudes would change. Maybe they would even go back to being a couple in love, like before the wedding. But that's not what happened. The boy was born, and Jeremias even prohibited her from registering him with his surname. Diana said that the man became completely paranoid and decided to rob him one night while she and the baby were sleeping. When the man returned home without the child, Diana became desperate and ran to call the police, but the man threatened her with a knife and said that it was too late for her to worry about that baby and that he had done what he had done, that she didn't have the courage to do, and that they should leave the city as quickly as possible. A year later, Jeremias died in a work accident at the logging plant, which relieved the woman of a life under constant threats. But the fact is that she never forgave herself for not being able to protect her own son. She developed a deep depression and still thinks about what her son would be like if he had survived. Everything I experience is a curse. A curse because of the crime I let happen against a defenseless child. My God, he was just a little baby. And now, You are here to arrest me." At this point in the story, not only she, but Brian was also crying. Eric then held her by the shoulders and said, "No one is going to arrest you. Now, take a deep breath and pay attention to what I'm about to say, because no one is joking here. I met your boy 16 years ago, and he's here now to meet you." Diana raised her head and observed Brian once again. She didn't know what to do or what to think. She was in shock. Finally, the two hugged again, 16 years later. The last time they did, Brian was just a newborn. "I survived," said the young man. At the end of that day, Eric Wilson felt complete like never before in his life. Not only had he met Brian again, but now the young man had a much better understanding of his own story. For a boy who had nothing but trash bags around him when he was found, he now had two moms, a dad, and a friend who would do anything for him. Doing good for others is the key to building a better world, because the kindness we sow today will be the hope we reap tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Comment below what you thought of this story and which city you are watching us from. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so that together we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories. Until later.